Have you ever looked at a flower or just some random tree in a park and wondered what its story is? I mean, we see them all the time, but for thousands of years, these ordinary plants have been seen as anything but ordinary. They were seen as being filled with myth, magic, and some pretty incredible power. What if I told you that a simple lotus blossom holds the secrets of creation itself? Or that a common garden herb like parsley was all tangled up in some seriously intense superstitions about life and death? See, these aren't just plants. They're major characters in humanity's oldest, wildest stories. For as long as we've been telling stories about plants. It's true. They've been our gods, our magic, our medicine, even our omens. So let's dive in and start uncovering the secret folklore of the plant kingdom. So, in this explainer, we're going to start our journey with the divine origins of sacred plants and ancient myths. Then, we'll venture into the dark magic of the witch's garden. After that, we'll see how plants became everyday omens. And finally, how they ended up as the symbols of our greatest love stories. Okay, first up, let's start with the big stuff, creation. I'm talking about the whole cosmos. For a lot of ancient cultures, the entire universe could be explained by looking at the life of a plant. Let's take the ancient Egyptians. For them, the lotus wasn't just some pretty flower. Oh no, it was a powerful symbol of rebirth and creation. And here's the really cool part. It was the plant's actual behavior that shaped their entire worldview. Think about it. The lotus opens its petals at dawn and closes them at dusk, sinking back into the water. To the Egyptians, this was a perfect mirror of the sun's journey, and by extension, the cycle of life, death, and resurrection. They literally believed the world began when a single lotus bud rose out of a primordial ocean, and its petals opened to reveal the sun god Ra. The lotus was so important, it even got its own god, Nefertem. He was the god of perfume and beauty, and you often see him shown as a child, sitting right on a lotus blossom. I mean, what a brilliant way to show the idea of birth and new beginnings, right? Rising up, all pure from the chaotic waters of creation. Okay, so let's hop from the banks of the Nile over to the forests of Europe. Here, a totally different plant held immense spiritual power, the mighty oak. This quote from the poet Herrick gives us a little hint of its sacred role as a place for remembrance and ritual. For the ancient Druids, oak groves were basically their cathedrals. These were natural places of just immense power, where they held their most sacred ceremonies. So, get this. When early Christian missionaries showed up, they didn't just chop all the trees down. Nope. They did something way smarter. They co-opted them. They would preach under these very same ancient oaks, which then became known as gospel oaks. It was such a clever way to use the tree's existing spiritual authority to introduce their new faith. A perfect bridge between two worlds. So we've gone from divine reverence, and now the stories are taking us into a world of darker, wilder magic. In this world, plants aren't just symbols of the gods, they're active ingredients for spells, for potions, and for dealing with all things supernatural. A lot of these plants really lived a kind of double life. Take mullein, for instance. To the village herbalist, it was a totally respected remedy, fantastic for treating things like coughs. But to a witch, well, its fuzzy leaves and tall stalk made it an essential ingredient for incantations and all sorts of magical workings. So the very same plant could be a tool for healing or a tool for dark magic. It really all just depended on who was using it. This kind of duality existed for a ton of plants, but there was one that was almost universally feared. A plant so powerful, so dangerous, that its name was whispered with this real sense of dread. The mandrake. For starters, its root often grew in this weirdly human-like shape, which was, creepy enough to give it a terrifying reputation. But the real danger was in harvesting it. The belief was that when you pulled a mandrake from the earth, it let out a shriek so powerful, so piercing, that it would kill anyone who heard it. So, how on earth did you get one? Well, folklore came up with this really grim and elaborate workaround. First, you'd have to carefully dig around the root. Then, you'd tie a strong rope from the plant to a dog's tail. Finally, from a safe distance, with your fingers jammed in your ears, you'd lure the dog to run, which would then pull the mandrake out of the ground. The poor dog would die from the shriek, but the harvester would survive, and now they'd have one of the most powerful magical ingredients in the world. All right, so from the high-stakes world of magic, let's bring it down to the superstitions of everyday life. For centuries, people looked to plants not just for medicine or spells, but for signs, for omens that could predict the weather, your fortune, or even your fate. Long before we had weather apps, farmers had their own methods, and they were, quite literally, rooted in the world around them. One of the most famous bits of weather lore involved watching two specific trees in the springtime.
If the oak comes out before the ash, it is a sign that there will be fine weather in harvest. Yep, the budding of the trees was a direct forecast for the summer. If the oak leafed out first, it meant you were in for a dry, sunny season. If the ash won the race, well, you'd better prepare for a wet, soggy summer.
And then you have parsley. You'd think it's just a simple, harmless herb, right? Wrong. So wrong. The superstitions around parsley are unbelievably complex and just all over the place. If you tried to transplant it, they said you were inviting death into your family. It grew badly because the devil supposedly took his share of the seed before it could even sprout. The only way to get a good crop was to plant the seeds on Good Friday. In some places, just giving it away was considered terrible luck. And to top it all off, it was also where you told kids babies came from. It's just wild. This one little herb was tied to the devil, death, good luck, and birth. All right, in our final section, we've arrived at what might be the most deeply human connection we have with plants, the way we've woven them into our stories of love, loss, and legend. The name of the forget-me-not? Well, it comes from one of the most heartbreaking little tales in all of plant lore. The story goes that a medieval knight and his lady were walking along the river Danube. The ladies saw this beautiful little cluster of blue flowers floating by. Being a gallant knight, he of course leapt into the river to grab them for her. But the current was just too strong, and weighed down by all his armor, he started to sink. With his last ounce of strength, he threw the bouquet to her on the bank, crying out, "Forget me not." And that's how the flower got its name. And you see this theme of beauty being born from tragedy all over the place. In Greek mythology, there's the story of the handsome youth Adonis, who was loved by the goddess Venus. He was tragically killed by a wild boar during the hunt. And the story says that where his blood fell to the earth, the red anemone sprang up, a flower as vibrant and as fragile as his life had been. So as we've seen, the plants all around us are so much more than just pretty decorations. They're actually living artifacts of our history, our beliefs, and our imagination. I mean, they've been our direct links to the divine, the key instruments of magic, the bearers of omens that helped us navigate our lives, and of course, the ultimate symbols of our deepest emotions. From the sacred to the superstitious, they've really played every part you can imagine. But you know, these stories aren't just trapped in ancient books. They're still here. They're growing in our gardens, in our parks, just waiting for us to rediscover them. So maybe the next time you see a simple flower, just ask yourself, what forgotten legend, what little piece of magic, what secret story is it telling?